Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's already afternoon. I know we are before a late lunch, but I hope we will be able, during this panel, to capture your attention. And I'm also looking forward to your active participation in a discussion during the second part of this panel. My name is Edgar Beugels. I am the moderator of the session. I'm the head of the Research and Development Unit, which is part of the Capacity Building Division of Frontex. And before introducing the panelists who we have this afternoon here for you, I would like to start to say a few words about the topic, the future of passenger traffic of this panel. As you are most probably all aware of it, that the air transport business, if I may call it like that, in Europe is under stress, if I may say so. On the one hand, there is growth, but we see that other parts of the world are experiencing even bigger growth than in Europe. Then there's also discussion about the airport capacity in Europe, the airport capacity that's not keeping pace with the potential growth in Europe. I read somewhere that we're talking about 1.9 million flights or additional flights we could have potentially based on passenger numbers and passenger requirements in Europe that are not there at the moment. At the same time, as you can imagine, such an amount of additional flights would mean a lot of additional stress on airports, airport infrastructure. IATA, and together with the Tourism Economics, which is an independent forecasting organization, published its 20-year passenger growth forecast. And they projected that the passenger numbers in 2034 will reach 7.3 billion, which is more or less doubling the amount of passengers we have seen in the last year. And although the growth rate in Europe will be relatively low, it still caters for almost 600 million additional passengers per year. The question now is, when talking about such a massive amount of people, of whom part will cross the border, if we will be able to handle that amount. Not only at the borders, but also as looking at the airport capacity. And is Europe ready to take that additional amount on? Sometimes I have the impression that Europe is not. Which direction will the European market then take? And which direction will border control take? And will there be in the future a European name attached to the growth? Or are we talking about Incheon, Changi, Hamad, Al Maktoum? Who knows? Having said that, I would like to continue with a brief introduction of the panelists. Starting here on my left-hand side, and also your left-hand side, with Huub Dijsselbloem. Huub is a professor of philosophy and of Science and Politics at the University of Amsterdam. And he's also a senior research fellow at the Netherlands Scientific Council for Government Policy in The Hague, a whole mouthful. Your research employs a combination of conceptual, normative, and empirical approaches. And I understood that your current project concerns the surveillance and counter-surveillance at the southern borders of Europe and the United States. The border is Mexico, I guess. Yeah. Then Charlotte North, Border Force Strategy Officer in the Home Office. You joined the Border Force relatively recently, December last year, and you work for the strategy and policy team that is involved in a range of strategy and policy projects that enable the Border Force to deliver its overarching vision. and you also translate legislative changes into guidance for the first line, for the front line of the border force. Before, you worked in the immigration and security minister, focusing on border force and border policy, and you also worked in the Her Majesty's Passport Office. Am I right? Yeah. Yes, okay. And finally, the biggest challenge for me, as far as the name is concerned, David Trembaczewski-Ryder, yes. You are head of the aviation security of the Airport Council International Europe. What this institution stands for, he will explain yourself later on. David is a retired UK Royal Air Force officer with significant experience working for NATO and EU policy development. And your last appointment was with the UK Permanent Representation to the European Union. And prior to that, you were seconded to the Council Secretariat of the EU, if I'm well informed. And you were also base commander of the Royal Air Force Station in Gibraltar, dealing with the different aspects of airfield operations and also security-related challenges. And you joined ACI Europe in February 2010, dealing with a whole range of aviation security-related issues affecting Europe's airports. That's, yeah, a good representation. Okay. Then, to start off the panel, I would like to ask a question to David, actually. I painted a little bit the picture of the different developments as far as aviation is concerned, also touching on the role of European airports in the future, taking into account the competition of airports in the Middle East, the three big ones, but also now coming up the development of the mega airport in Istanbul. We have seen that as far as international passengers is concerned, that London Heathrow recently has lost its first position to Dubai. How do you see these developments? What kind of role are European airports going to play in the future? Are they still going to be hubs, or are the European airports just going to be feeders into these mega hubs that are there or are being developed at the moment? And do you see that the future development will have any impact on the way border control is conducted in the EU? Can we stay with the same process? Or taking into account the developments, do you see that there should be changes introduced in the way border control is conducted?
Thanks, Edgar. I'd like a long list of questions there, really. Perhaps I ought to explain what ACI is. ACI is Airports Council International. It's the only worldwide body representing airports. We have 1,800 airports as members around the world. I work in the European region, and we have 460 airport members in Europe from 45 different European countries. We represent all their interests in terms of not only security, safety, environment, facilitation, etc. I think one thing that's important to note, and Edgar gave a couple of figures there, and I'll perhaps put a slide up now, which gives you an indication of what we're talking about. Air transport actually goes in hand with growth. It has been all the time. You can see very clearly that it's international trade, it's the interdependence between different economies, it's globalization, growth of tourism, and of course people want to go places. Historically, it's been North America and Europe that have led the way very much. But as Edgar pointed out, we're starting to see a shift in the balance. You can see on the slide there that currently North America, Europe, and Asia Pacific have roughly the same number of passengers in 2009. But you look at 2030, and the balance will shift significantly. It doesn't mean to say that there won't be quite a lot of growth still in Europe, because there is still quite a lot of growth. You look at having to accommodate that number of passengers with largely the same or roughly the same kind of infrastructure, maybe the same number of people, maybe not. It actually has a significant bearing on both border forces and aviation security, because what you're trying to do is, if you like, get more bang for your buck. You're trying to process more people, whether it be for border control or whether it be for aviation security. Will the hubs in the Middle East take our traffic? They will certainly take some, but I think there's still a demand very much for the connection with Europe. Europe is still a major centre for trade and commerce. The transatlantic trade will still continue. And just to give you one little figure, Heathrow Airport, whilst it's lost its top position, is still pretty important. It has more transatlantic flights to the United States every day, over 100 a day, more than Charles de Gaulle, Frankfurt, Madrid, and Schiphol. So the other 4 major hubs in Europe. So there is a significant business requirement to keep those going. Now, how do we keep that up is another matter. So whilst we can see that the shift will be somewhere else, there'll still be significant growth and significant capacity issues. Perhaps if you go back one slide, just to show you the European picture, to slide number 4. If you see that where Europe is largely a mature market, and bearing in mind I said that we got 45 airports in 45 countries in Europe, so that those figures for non-EU is largely Turkey and Russia, the growth in passenger numbers, because they were starting from a relatively low base. But even within the EU, the passenger numbers have grown between 2008 and 2014, as you can see, by almost 9%, so not insignificant. There is going to be real challenges, and I think we'll discuss those a bit later on. So perhaps you go back to number 5 again, and we'll leave it on that. And perhaps we'll hand over to someone else, Edgar. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, David. Well, taking into account what you see, that there still will be growth in Europe, and also taking into account that most probably the infrastructure will not change that much. There are no plans at the moment, if I right, about creating a completely new airport, although in London they're still under discussion. But I think it's safe to say that in the majority of cases we will not see any new airport, which means that we have to do with what we have. And taking that into account and looking towards HUP now, do you see that, as far as air transport is concerned, that we should look into new ways of checking passports and performing security checks then? And do you see that maybe the introduction of more modern technology will provide us a way out in the sense of dealing with the satellised airports and still being able to keep up with the passenger growth?
Well, for sure, everybody will be looking at the airports, because I think historically airports have become iconic for globalization. At the turn of the century, before 9/11, people spoke about the kinetic elite, about the new group of travelers for whom the world was their oyster, so to say, and the airport became the icon of that globalized feeling. But from the very beginning, technology and airports have been closely related, of course. In the first days, the airport copied itself more to the railway station, although back then the railway trains had to offer were more luxurious, whilst planes were more expensive. Later on, the shopping mall became the example for how to design an airport, and the most prominent technologies back then were glass structures, architectural designs, in combination with escalators. And don't forget, one of the most important inventions of the 20th century, air conditioning. Air conditioning was central, of course, to shopping malls, but also to airports. I think in the 90s, what happened is that a new metaphor was introduced. after the station, the shopping mall, the internet became one of the leading metaphors for how to regard passengers traffic and mobility in general. To pick out two things specifically, the seamless web became a very important metaphor to make sure that passengers in a way are not aware of crossing a border, are not aware of the whole structure and the connectivity between the different layers of an airport, but feel as if it's one flow. The second, perhaps that's not the internet, but more Amazon-based, was the one-click feeling. You don't have to order everything or fill in every form once and once again, although you still have to. But it made traveling feel as if you were ordering a book. With one click, you could go everywhere. Future developments, perhaps we can anticipate on that later on in this session. There's one thing specifically I would like to mention, and that's the implementation of robots. Predictions now are, of course, well, I think everybody has seen these reports that in the whole labor markets, a significant amount of work might be taken over by robots, and that's not only in manual labor, but also mainly in information processing, information management, and then perhaps more the assisting functions in migration, in information management. So perhaps it's interesting to reflect on that, what that means or might mean and might not mean for the organization of the airports in relation to security questions.
Thank you, Huub. The one-click experience, yes, and the info processing management. And now looking towards Charlotte, the UK has undertaken quite some work to allow the identification of individuals who you want to have a closer look at as border force, and has set up a center to do that. And maybe you can tell us a little bit about the functioning of that center and also how this contributes or can potentially contribute to this one-click experience Huub was talking about.
Okay, thank you. The center isn't run by robots yet. So thank you for that introduction and the opportunity really to describe one of Border Force's capabilities, which is a targeting capability, and some people may already be aware of it, but we have a National Border Targeting Centre, so we have a designated centre where, and it was established about 5 years ago, and there are about 200 staff working there now, but importantly they are staff, not just Border Force staff, they are from a range of agencies. They are also police colleagues and National Crime Agency staff based there. And one of the functions of that centre is to carry out what we call rules-based targeting, which I'll probably talk about at various points during this discussion. And rules-based targeting is it's an intelligence-led process, and I can describe intelligence-led a bit better in a second. As you say, Edgar, it helps us to identify people we might want to take a closer look at. And that's done through a series of rules and profiles and matches. But really what the overarching aim of rules-based targeting is that Border Force can make assessments of people, look at people as early as possible in the process of them travelling, possibly even, ideally even before their departure, but certainly ideally before their arrival at the UK border. And we don't think that process replaces the need for border guards in any way. It is part of a toolkit of things that we can do. It means that our border guards can be more selective based on these matches, based on the profiles that they're looking for when people arrive physically at their desks. So in that respect, it is seeking to make the flows of traffic easier for legitimate travellers, whilst focusing on high harm individuals and being, as you say, being more selective about who we might choose to intercept or hold up at the border. Shall I go into a little bit more detail, or do you want to come back to it? A little bit more detail, okay. So we're looking, the rules-based targeting capability looks at unknowns, and for us those are unknown entities across a range of functions, so customs interests, people who might be bringing in drugs, tobacco or cash into the country, also from an immigration perspective, and that can include traffickers and facilitators, and also organised crime and counter-terrorism. So, we're looking at unknowns across a range of areas. And the focus with rules-based targeting is really on passenger behaviour. So it looks at routes and booking patterns. And the rules-based targeting creates then profiles from rules. So the rules are intelligence-led. They are based on either existing seizures, existing and concrete information that we have about a particular pattern. Say, a cash ticket bought at short notice. And they're also intelligence-led in the sense of coming from our partners, our UK law enforcement partners or our overseas partners. And the rules are set against API information, advanced passenger information, exit check information, and PNR, passenger name records, and then washed against the carrier data in the way that it would be for a known alert. And that generates some potential matches, and we can go on to hone those matches to ensure that they're proportionate, to ensure that they're the ones we want to be focusing on, and to then inform either our partners and our networks overseas, excuse me, to look into them in more detail or respond to those matches, or our border guards can do so as well.
Just to elaborate a little bit on that, you mentioned that part of it is to make it easier for the traveler. But being a passenger regularly myself, I ask myself the question, okay, but how? In other words, it helps you to do your business. Is it supposed to make it easier on me? How? What do I get out of it? I mean, how does it make it easier for me as a traveler?
Yeah. Well, as with the whole border guard community, Border Force is seeking to balance that maintaining security with passenger flows. So it really is in our minds that we need to facilitate the travel for legitimate passengers. And really what we hope that the rules-based targeting capability will do is move the assessments or interventions a bit earlier up the process, a bit earlier on, so that they're not all taking place in your arrivals hall, in amongst a number of passengers, many of which, as we know, will be legitimate. So it is trying to seek out high harm or high risk passengers and make that distinction as early on as we can.
So that means that I will have to wait for a shorter period of time for my border check. Ideally speaking.
Ideally,
Okay.
yeah.
Just now looking towards David, because aviation security is also your business. We talk about border control. This is one touch point I have as a passenger at an airport. The other one is the physical security check that takes place at an airport. I mean, from a passenger point of view, I find it quite annoying, all those checks, and I have to show my boarding pass here and my passport there, and then again my boarding pass and my passport. Isn't there any smarter way of organizing this business? How do you see that? I mean, like you said, the passenger flows are increasing, and I want to make sure that I can go through this whole process in an amount of time that I can, as a passenger, more or less predict. Because I don't want to, you know, when I have to travel, I start to calculate back. I need to be so much time in advance, and during that time block that I have then at the airport, I should be able to take all these hurdles. So how do you see that? That I, as a passenger, can be have more security about the amount of time that I would spend taking these hurdles of aviation security and border checks?
We share the view, like Charlotte was talking about, in terms of balancing security and passenger facilitation very much. There are a number of things that airports do. And just a little fact is that the vast majority of airports in Europe, other than Germany, it's the airports who are responsible for aviation security. And most airports in Europe are either privately owned and privately run, or privately run but government owned or local council run. So it's the airport responsible, not a government agency other than in Germany, it's the Bundespolizei. In terms of the touch point, and one of the things that we explore very much within the airport community is that often the first point of contact that a passenger has with the airport experience is at security checkpoint. It's the first point. And a number of things that airports do is, for instance, one of the things that people say, it's sort of historically said that, we don't like the long queues and the divestment procedure, you have to take this, that, and the other off. Well, first of all, many airports have a service level agreement with their airlines, or they're mandated by their regulator, and typically, and there are variations by a couple of minutes, a couple of percentage, typically it says something like 95% of passengers should get through the checkpoint within 5 minutes. I'd like to see some border points do that as well, actually, to be quite frank. And if they don't meet those objectives, then they pay a fine, and quite a big fine, to the airline or to the government. So there's a big incentive to try and get people through. We are working on a number of products and a number of methodologies and new technology so that passengers don't have to divest. You don't have to take your belt off. You don't have to take your jacket off. You don't have to take your laptop out or your liquids out of your bag. They should be able to stay in. That'll be a couple of years away, but we're currently, one piece of equipment is being tested in Schiphol, and we'll be testing some more at the end of this year and towards the next year. And so very much it's in the airport's interest to make sure that everyone's safe and secure, bearing in mind that 99.999% recurring of passengers are law-abiding. The trouble is that in terms of regulation, aviation is the most heavily regulated business anywhere, I think. And you look at how regulation is set, and it's always reactive to the last known threat. And as a consequence, we have to, airports have to buy new screen technology, whether it's for liquids, whether it's for a different cabin baggage screening, whether it's body scanners, security scanners, have to continuously buy new equipment to find new threats. And what we're trying to do is a bit like Charlotte explained, is move to a more risk-based process, whereby we can look for, one, the low-hanging fruit, if you like, the people of low risk, a bit like the American pre-check system, so that you can do some background checks, some checks on passengers beforehand, before they get to the airport, so they don't have to divest so much. They can keep their light jackets on, they can keep their belts on, keep their shoes on, and so on. And that's what we'd like to aim towards. But the issue at the moment, of course, is that regulation doesn't allow that. and it's something they're working towards in a project we've got with IATA called Smart Security. I can talk about more later on, but it's certainly one way we're aiming. And I think that finally, in this point, you may think that, and actually who discussed about the shopping malls at airports, and some of them are great shopping experiences, you have to admit. They're really nice shops. And just a couple of snippets. The Brussels airport, the chocolate shops there, sell more chocolates there than anywhere else in the world, by a long way. Some of the shops at Heathrow, some of the flagship stores of some of the main clothes shops, for instance, high-end shops, they have the biggest turnover, the biggest profit of any shops in the world, compared to, say, even in the high street in Paris or in London or wherever. And you might think, well, that's just airports grabbing money. But bear in mind that the fees that airlines pay for landing and parking their aircraft at airports does not cover by any stretch of the imagination the amount of it costs to maintain the infrastructure, the runway, taxiways, and other facilities. So indirectly, by you purchasing things in the shops at airports, you're subsidizing the air tickets indirectly. And as a consequence, airports spend a lot of money in trying to make sure they're welcoming places. If any of you have been to Schiphol recently, or to Gothenburg in Sweden, or in Gatwick, you'll see how security checkpoints used to be a bit like prison entrances. They were grey and steel and dark and miserable. Actually, we realised that the passenger is our customer. You don't treat customers like that. Actually, you want to make it welcoming. You actually want to make them happy. Because if they are unhappy in the security checkpoint, they're not going to spend any money. And that's the ultimate. And actually going to be dissatisfied. And you don't want dissatisfied people. And it's not fair because the majority of them are law-abiding citizens. Thanks.
Thank you, David. One question I would have in continuation to you, because Charlotte talked about the risk-based approach for border control. You also hinted towards having a risk-based or more risk-based approach for aviation security. What about integration between the two processes?
We actually work in silos at the moment, from what I can see. If you look at the information, all passengers, in terms of aviation security, are treated exactly the same. We do 100% screening on all passengers. No one's treated differently. Is that right? I don't think so. So how do you deal, for instance, the airports have no, I repeat, no data on passengers. We don't get data. We don't know your name when you're traveling through. The airlines do. They have the data on the PNR or the API. Airports don't have that. If we wish to differentiate passengers either to high risk, unknown risk, or low risk, then certainly we need to make use of that exactly the same way as border forces do. And it's something that hopefully we'll be able to make use of when the PNR directive hopefully will be signed off at the end of this year. But there's clearly at the moment, there's two stovepipes. There's border, aviation security. And almost they don't mix. There's lots of good information that border forces have. There's lots of good information that aviation security airports have. And we calculated there are at least 30 touch points in a passenger's journey where you gather intelligence, data, or information. Currently, that's not fused. That is not shared. We work separately, and perhaps we have to look at working together in the future.
Charlotte, do you see any potential for this?
I take the point, absolutely. I think we're clearly striving towards the same aims, which is to mitigate threat and facilitate legitimate travel. Border Force's approach is very much, it is a layered approach. It's about using the information, the advanced passenger information, as best we can. We use our networks, as I described before, overseas to then explore those further or to take appropriate action. And we are now seeing, we're doing that as well with exit data, exit from the UK data increasingly. So that's kind of where we're at. But I agree, we're sort of singing from the same hymn sheet, to use that idiom.
Huub, we have heard that new checks that are being introduced are often reactive. We have seen it after 9/11 and other events. In your articles, you describe migrants, travelers, as a group of vulnerable individuals who can be used by authorities as test subjects. This kind of development of always new checks being introduced after events, nobody's asking really the question, the added value, nobody's asking the individuals. This is on the one hand. On the other hand, we also see introduction of some new technologies where you have an option in the sense that if you provide some additional information as an individual, you may have a benefit, being processed in a more expedited way than normally would be the case. How do you see the balance between these two developments?
Yeah, you introduced the passenger perspective earlier on. To me, going to the airport and taking a plane feels like going to school now or going to work, whilst perhaps it had to do with my mindset as a student in the 90s. It was more like going to an amusement park. It was entertainment, or at least it should be relaxing to go there. I think that's still one of the main aims, that you want to have relaxed passengers. And people are relaxed, but you feel more relaxed once you're better prepared. And I make this comparison with school because you have to do your homework, you have to prepare for it. You know you're being monitored over there. You can be excluded if you do not behave properly, and the same applies to a working situation, of course. But I think there are, for the public at large, it's important to make a distinction, although distinction is slightly artificial, between the technologies we are actually confronted with, like an iris scan, or not at an airport, but like, let's say, fingerprinting, a passport check, and the ones we are not directly confronted with, the risk-based technologies, the information systems that are used for profiling. I often make the analogy with a laboratory. Border control in Europe, and specifically at the airport, can be compared with a laboratory. But again, I think the intriguing thing about this laboratory is twofold. On the one hand, the comparison goes into the direction of the implementation of new technologies. That's the laboratory function. The other thing a laboratory does is more, sorry for the word, conceptual. You create new categories. For instance, the category of the trusted traveler. And the trusted traveler is not a real person. It's a representation of existing behavior, or at least monitored behavior. So it's not completely artificial, but it's a construction. And I think the main questions in the future will be oriented towards the evidence-based nature of these new categories, because they can be highly influential, especially when you skip the 100% screening function, and once risk-based analysis becomes more and more important, people will feel they have to trust the statistics that's being used there. Amazingly, or surprisingly, until now, the public does not seem to have much trouble with the first category of technologies, the things you actually meet at an airport, like the body scans. 2 days ago, the BBC reported a survey among 700 people. That's more than 77% of the UK population wouldn't mind having more body scans at the airport. They feel very comfortable with that. So we are, you did a good job in training us to discipline ourselves, to follow the rules and the kind of behavior that is necessary to create a relaxed atmosphere at today's airports, I think.
Well, it's an interesting point, because just to add an element to the discussion, also with the body scans, but in general with the security process, as David has highlighted, that we push everybody through a similar process. Aren't we doing that because actually we are not doing a good job with predicting people's behavior? In other words, I can easily have a knife in my pocket and catch a plane and fly to wherever, because I do not have any bad intention with the knife. But because we are not doing a good job with predicting the behavior of people, we submit everybody to the check, and whenever a knife is found, it's lifted out and confiscated. How do you see that?
Well, I think one of the problems is that we're looking for bad objects as opposed to bad people. I mean, very much focused. If you look at the prohibited articles list in Regulation 185, it's a publicly available document. It lists, knives with a blade longer than 6 centimeters, or scissors longer than 6 centimeters. You've got, obviously, guns, which we don't find too many in Europe, although there are plenty in North America. Any kind of explosives, any kind of clubs are excluded. And if you look at the evolution of regulation, that's because we're trying to close and react to the last known threat. And if you look at knives and guns, that was particularly as a result of the hijackings that took place in the 70s and 80s. If you look at the whole baggage screen, that took place, that 100% whole baggage screening was a result of Lockerbie. You look at the body scanners, whilst they're not mandatory in Europe's airports, except in the UK, where they have mandatory made body scanners a requirement for certain secondary checks, then that was because the underpants bomber that flew from Amsterdam tried to blow himself up over Detroit on Christmas Day 2009. You look at that, the reaction to the last known threat. A little point on body scanners, though. Interesting to note, which would you, as passengers, prefer? Would you prefer to go through a body scanner? Just put your hand up. Not literally, but I mean, you go through a body scanner, you put your hands up for 3 seconds, you're scanned, and then if they find you've left a comb or your boarding pass in your pocket, you just do have a targeted search. Would you prefer that, or would you prefer a full hand pat down that's done properly? Perhaps I can ask the question, perhaps you can put your hand up. Would you prefer a body scanner, hands up, to a full hand pat down? Yeah, majority. Which is one of the reasons why actually people in the UK have said they prefer a body scanner, because it's less intrusive. It doesn't touch you. Actually, the security staff don't like doing it either. You imagine having to pat down lots of sweaty passengers. Not very nice. And actually, it's better for security, because a body scanner can actually, most places have walk-through metal detector. What does that detect? It detects metal. It's a giveaway in the name, isn't it? It doesn't detect non-metallic threats. What do you think Al-Qaeda and ISIS associates are doing? They're developing non-metallic bombs that will go through the walk-through metal detectors. The security scanner can detect those. So it's better security, it's better for passenger facilitation, it's also better for the staff as well. But you need to look at how you can blend that into a friendly, customer-focused approach. A number of airports actually give their security personnel customer service training. I look at Gatwick as an example. They have 1,200 staff. They're airport employees, privately owned airport. And when they became separate from BAA or Heathrow, they said, right, we're going to actually give all our staff, customer service training. Some of the staff couldn't do it. You know why? Because they were security agents. They were like this. I'm a security guard. I don't do customer-friendly type stuff. But you know what they found? Those people left. The ones who stayed, all of a sudden, a simple thing like saying, good morning, good afternoon, have a nice trip. What it meant was the passengers divested. They took their things out they needed to take more quickly. But more importantly, it meant there was less aggression between passenger and staff, so less hassle. Also, you could notice any anomalies. You could notice people who were nervous for the wrong reasons. It also meant they went through this checkpoint quicker on their way to the shops quicker. But so there were lots of gains in that kind of attitude and actual way of doing business. Unfortunately, it doesn't. We're spreading the world. It hasn't actually got in place everywhere yet, but we're working on it.
Huub, you wanted to react, and after that, Charlotte.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's crucial what you mentioned there. Often I compare the use of technologies for border control with how computers are used in chess. There's nothing as boring as watching a match between two computers. It's the most boring thing there is. 20 years ago, people thought that would be the future. Intelligence-led chess. What the practice now is that the best chess players in the world know how to use their software, know how to use the computer in their training programs. So the best results are created by a double transformation of the aims of the computer and the transformation of training practices. So I think indeed these training practices in man-machine, if you like, interaction are crucial. One thing I would like to add is I think that goes beyond customer friendliness. It's not only a service. I think it's crucial to avoid the situation of the computer says no. Sorry, we have no explanation for you, but there's something, we have to check it, and there appears nobody who can give you an answer right there, right now. So this training should also, and I think you can, both of you can elaborate on it much more, should always be how to have the best interaction between the humans and let's say the non-humans that are also at work at airports in particular, but in border control situations in general.
Charlotte, before you start reacting, maybe you can also elaborate a little bit on what David was saying, that security check is looking for objects and not for intentions, because border control, to a large extent, is looking for the intention. And I'm still wondering whether there could be a combination between the two things, so that also security checks could be more focused and not only depend on the image of a body scan or a metal detector whatsoever, but more focused on the intention.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. And your original point was about not being very good at predicting behaviours, and is that why we still have to do the checks and things? Well, I think I would say that what we can do in the targeting space is only one of a number of things. So therefore, it helps us, and it helps us based on existing criteria that we know to focus our energies, but it does still allow that interaction with border force officers, border guards, at the appropriate point. And then I agree with the points made about then needing to give our border force officers the right tools, the training to pick out anomaly behaviours or spot those intentions which are perhaps a bit more nuanced than anything which might have been explicitly written down in advanced passenger information. So it's for us it's a layered approach, and it's using as much as we can to build a picture and to make the right intervention. And the outcomes suggest that we can make more targeted interventions. So in the customs environment where we're looking for drugs and tobacco, etc., and cash, we have statistics to show that an interception by our border guards based on the rules targeting is vastly more effective than a cold stop in the customs channel to that effect. So we are seeing the outcomes, and we're using those outcomes and feeding them back into the process to bolster the rules and things, but it's one of a number of things.
One of the dangers, if I may say so, the risks when you're talking about an approach based on targeting is the potential for discrimination, stigmatization of people. How is this dealt with in the approach in the UK?
Well, I mean, actually, if you're an immigration officer or a customs official, and you're making an interception based on some targeting that's happened, you're actually making a more informed interception. So you are being less discriminatory than potentially you could be if you were just looking around based on no former knowledge. So there's that element, but it's a really important point. Clearly, we must make sure that the data we use is proportionate and absolutely necessary, and for that reason we discard information that doesn't strictly fit the rules and criteria that we're looking for, and hope that gives reassurance that it's been treated in the right way, that it is therefore not discriminatory. And as I mentioned at the start, it's intelligence-led, and that means based on existing tangible outcomes that we have already experienced or that our partners have shared with us. So it's based on fact, and that is a really important aspect of the capability.
Is there anything you want to say about that?
Yes, discrimination. I think if you relate that question indeed to risk analysis and information technologies, one of the main principles here at stake is purpose limitation. That's specific technology developed for a specific goal, and the data that are gathered together and stored in it are manipulated and applied in different contexts, apply to that initial goal. I think the EU has, because it's very difficult to restrict and limit the use of data, of course, has set two conditions. One is purpose specification and the other is compatible use. Yet still, I think there will always be tensions here, because if you look at technological developments, a technology, its development is not finished once it leaves the lab. It goes through and through. Users add to it, different practices, different cultures even add to the use and the implementation of these technologies. And with that use, the purpose might change because of different changing political orientations, new practices, new problems that arise, or because interesting combinations appear. If you want to cross the two silos you mentioned earlier, you will have to deal with this whole aspect of purpose limitation. So I think that from the point of view of law and regulation, the conditions that have been described for this notion of purpose limitation might do well, but in practice you will see that it's at the very heart of technological development that the purposes will always change. So I think that will be one of the main challenges for data management in the future.
Thank you. David, if you look at the recent Skytrax World Airport Awards, and talking about the top 10 of the airports, the world airports there are 4 European airports in the top 10. First one on the 3rd place, the second one on the 6th place. However, curiously enough, those 2 airports are mid-sized airports. They are not the big hubs in Europe. And it just makes me wonder if this is maybe what at least the European traveler wants, to travel via mid-sized airports and not via the big hubs anymore.
I'm not sure, actually. Depends where you're going to go. One of the things, we've done a connectivity report, and it looks at how airports connect between other destinations. And you can see, certainly, in Europe, we have lost connectivity. Coming to the very first point in this panel discussion about the competition from the Middle Eastern hubs and from Turkey, although Turkey is a part of our European region, so it's a bit difficult, really. The connectivity shows that there's a huge amount of spider's web around. Clearly, you would like to fly from your local airport if it's convenient and it's going to the destination where you want to go to. And you might say the low-cost carriers have actually enabled that significantly, because they go to places, different places and smaller places. So I think that there is maybe a limit to how much the bigger hubs can grow. And not least of all, for instance, Heathrow's at 98% capacity. It can't take any more aircraft on its runways. So it either needs to grow or something. And that's the different political debate. And a lot of people, I take an example of my mother, who lives in the West Midlands of England, and when she travels to Brussels to visit me, she likes to go over West Midlands. Nice little airport, dead friendly, dead easy, not too big. And of course, if you go to a big international hub, whether it be Schiphol or Charles de Gaulle or Heathrow, or whatever, you can sometimes walk miles, almost literally, to get from if you're certainly transferring. So people do like a friendly atmosphere. We can certainly see, in terms of our growth figures, and we collect figures every month and produce a report every year, that it tends to be the smaller, sometimes very small airports and airports less than 20 million that actually are growing quicker, perhaps because they've got more capacity. We talked about the capacity crunch. We talked about the fact of availability of space and airspace for the bigger hubs. And it may be just they got more catching up to do. As more and more passengers want to travel, then yes, the small and medium-sized airports will probably get more and more traffic. There's less margin for bigger airports to grow because they're already very big. And Heathrow grows its traffic numbers, I think 73 million last year. And that's largely by having bigger aircraft with more people on, not by more aircraft landings, because there aren't any more slots available. So you can see how there is a move. Interesting, you talk about the Skytrax Award. Actually, not last year, but the previous 2 years, the top airport was Copenhagen. Came twice for best passenger security processing for 2 years running, which was the first time a European airport had come top place. For quite some time. It had always been Changi or Incheon or one of the Asian airports. And sometimes, of course, those awards, they just let you know it's the passengers who vote. And of course, if some passengers are very proud of their airport, they tend to vote more than others. So it's a slight reflection, but it's not necessarily the whole truth.
Charlotte, David mentioned the low-cost carriers that at least some of them fly from relatively small airports, which leads to a more kind of fragmented flow of people crossing the border. How do you see this impacting the work of the border guards? Because instead of being focused on a few bigger hubs, we see now that it is spread out all over the place. And do you think that there's a need for rethinking of the border control process as a consequence?
Well, probably it means we need to work smarter, but then we're already working smarter in the context of changing threats, changing migratory flows, resource issues. So hopefully we're sufficiently adept at that we can surge or flex our workforce as a result of it. And I wouldn't anticipate doing that with the workforce complementing, levels of automation. So we already have e-gates at a number of sites, I think 18 key airports at the moment in the UK and probably growing. And coming back to the sort of the risk-based point, the more confident we get in our targeting, the more we can gain confidence in in deploying our border guards to individual locations or responding to individuals where we think there's a threat or a high harm element, and that plays into the resource issue clearly.
Huub, I mean, listening to Charlotte and also supplementing the humans, the people with machines, the e-gates, it raises the question if the technology as such can be trusted at all. Some of the experts say that the use of the technology is prone to errors, to inequalities, that there is no place for individual assessment anymore, although Charlotte said there is always the possibility of human intervention. How do you see that?
Yeah. Well, there will always be errors. No technology is completely finalized when put into practice. Sometimes technologies are put into practice really fast. If you look at the body scanners, how they were implemented at Schiphol, that was an amazing process. Well, if you compare it with a new drug that's developed by the pharmaceutical industry, for instance, the whole trajectory of research, development, regulation, testing, financing, of course, easily takes 15 years. Whilst here in the business of border control, you see that things pop up really quickly. Some things, for instance, are surprisingly, robots are put into business. Düsseldorf has robots that park your car. Schiphol has robots that help sort the baggage. Indianapolis has robots that provide you with information, although I think that the word robot is a bit much for what they have there. It's more an iPad on a stick that's gliding through the airport. Dubai has a service officer who, he, is a robot and helps you find the toilets, the bathroom, if you like. But that has more to do with servers than with border control. If I may add a more general perspective, I'm quite surprised how airports still manage, even after 9/11 and other events, to feel as a safe place. And they are a city, they are a global city, they're an air-conditioned city. They are housing hotels, casinos, shops, but they're also housing other things. They're housing courts sometimes, they're housing detention centers. So it's a city with very different neighborhoods, but to the outside world, it's still this feel-good world that defines the overall image they have. So perhaps in a way, what has happened with the risks related to airplanes are not fully connected to airports. They're still two different worlds, and that has, I think, very positive aspects. But it surprises me in a way how that image is still so sustainable.
Thanks, Huub. Also taking into account the time, I would like to give the opportunity to the audience to raise questions to the panelists. If you would be so kind to state your name and where you're from, and also to indicate to whom the question is directed, that would be very helpful.
Is it working? Is it working already? Yes. Hello, my name is Helen Neider-Vermand. I'm from Estonia, and being within the Estonian Police and Border Guard responsible for the integrated border management bureau's activities. We were talking here quite long now, and the panel was based on the airport traffic. And at the same time, I had a question in my mind that we have in Europe almost 12,000 kilometers of land borders. And as you probably know, that on land borders, the things could be totally different. And my questions in relation to that are that do we need for the land borders different systems or different solutions or procedures what to follow? This is something we need to also take into account, and especially knowing that in some crossings there are long queues of heavy vehicles waiting for days and days and days, and how in these conditions facilitate passenger traffic and legitimate passenger traffic and spot those who are posing danger or some questions for the border controls. I don't know if I can address these questions to some of the panelists, but maybe the Dutch representative can somehow elaborate on that, or the others as well. Thank you.
I hope you can, but also I would like to hear from Charlotte whether a more targeted approach could facilitate the land border crossing. But maybe first Huub and then Charlotte.
Yeah, thank you for your question. Indeed, we have been talking very long. Sorry for that. The general remark I would like to make is indeed, I think we need a more comprehensive account about the relationships between the different controls at land, sea, and in the air, because they relate and they interact as well. For instance, you cannot fully understand the drama that's taking place at the Mediterranean without taking the Evros Wall into account. Another example, I think public opinion is probably convinced of the fact that most people that stay in Europe illegally came by boat, whilst I guess at least in the northwestern part it are the overstayers, the people who came by airplanes and stayed here. So the different borders are communicating in a way. And as a researcher, I always say we need to do more research to understand the interaction between these different spots and between the different policies that are taking place. So I fully agree that we need to take that interaction more into account than we have done so far.
Charlotte?
And I would just add that you're right, we can fall into the trap of just speaking exclusively in an airport scenario, probably because traditionally we have had richer data in that mode, and people check in much more advanced than they might do, for example, just showing up at a Eurostar or a rail station or whatever. So yeah, it's absolutely worth us thinking wider. We're using targeting capability across all modes. It isn't just exclusive to air, and we are therefore making a concerted effort with carriers and partners to gain good information, advanced passenger information for different modes. I appreciate that it's the land border is different again to the maritime or rail that I might be keeping in mind. So I don't think I know all the answers, but I think advanced data can work, to an extent. But worth thinking about for sure.
Advanced data, maybe also time slot. This could something to be considered. Combination of the two. Any other questions? Yeah.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Aya Kalna. I'm representing European Police College CPOL. And I have a question to Charlotte, because basically what you are talking about, although you are not calling it so, as a police officer, I absolutely understand and support. As a citizen, unfortunately, not so. And you might not know that, but CPOL used to be located in the UK, but I happen to be from Eastern European country. So when I was returning from my holiday, we were asked, my whole family was asked to present a second ID document. I understand the reasons, and of course I asked about the reasons. How do you deal with these situations of actually discriminating people? How do you inform passengers of what these procedures entail? Because if people are informed earlier, I don't think that these dissatisfactions would happen.
Thank you. You're right. Hub earlier touched on this distinction between technology that people see and is more transparent versus the stuff that happens perhaps more in the background and therefore isn't surfaced sufficiently. I think lots of people buy into the idea of increased safety and security, so it is for us or for governments to think about how we give the right reassurances that we're using data in the right way, that we are, you know, with the best intentions, trying to focus the search, trying to move the assessments earlier on in the process where we can, and that from a data integrity perspective, you know, we are focusing it, using it for clear, defined purposes, and not being unclear about our remit in that respect. But that doesn't always account for the experiences people might have, or you know, at a particular border crossing at a particular time. So possibly more work to do, and I wonder if it's a messaging issue, a reassurance issue, without giving away the sort of the real granular detail of sort of what happens and when and why and things, because that's sort of the nature of targeting a bit. So take on board your comments, absolutely.
Any other questions? Yep, over there.
Hello, thanks very much. My name is Ira Bliatka. I'm a trainee with Frontex, but I'm also a PhD candidate in Aberystwyth, Wales, and I'm asking this question with my PhD hat on. We're talking about how to possibly coordinate the work that humans can do and the work non-humans can do, and you offer a defined distinction between detecting intentions and detecting objects. But I'm wondering what happens when the two, not intentions and objects, humans and non-humans, have kind of a conflicting interest in terms of machines can steal jobs, basically. So what's a way out of that?
And to whom is this question directed?
I would like the academic perspective, but I think from a practical point of view, that would be also interesting.
Yeah, thank you. There will often be conflicting interests. My car and I have a daily experience with it. I want to move, my car doesn't want to, somehow. Maybe it's too old. But when you're talking about the jobs, I think the reports that are coming out right now about the huge amount of people who have to from middle class environments who have to fear for their job. I think they are slightly overestimating the case, because historically you see that technologies take over one part of the job or take over a category of jobs, but other jobs are created. For instance, the technical maintenance will have to be done by humans. Very important, the training of human, non-human interactions will create more jobs that I hope will not be given by the robot, but by people around there. And most importantly, you will see a shift. Some human jobs become more important, like perhaps the better trained, the highly educated jobs, interpreting information, communicating with different people. So it's I don't want to use the word lower, but it's more the assisting information processing jobs that are in the dangerous corners, so to say. You see that in the financial service industry, for instance. There's a huge loss of jobs over there because most functions can be, in the assisting atmosphere, can be taken over by software and Google.
It sounds a bit like a discussion between automatic and automated. Maybe Charlotte, you want to elaborate on that?
Well, I would just add that I think there's definitely space for both to exist. They do at the moment. In fact, our e-gates rollout in the UK has led us to look at actually how we equip our border force staff in a different way, perhaps to look at behaviours in a queue for e-gates. And so there's always, it's a shifting picture. You're always looking at new ways to train, to embrace the new technology that we all benefit from as passengers. And we do, I like to have my little scan barcode when I check in, but it's complementing that and making sure that where we need a human interaction, we have one, so that we don't miss people by virtue of automation. But I think there's room for both, basically.
David, I believe, well, based on recent experience, what I see when we're talking about security filters at the airport, in some cases I have the impression that even more staff is employed nowadays in order to meet the demands or the agreements that were made with carriers. What's your impression?
Yeah, in fact, I mean, you might say a lot of airports are more security service providers rather than airports, because they have most of their staff, the large majority of their staff are actually directly engaged in security and not in other functions within the airport. I think in terms of the interface between machine and man, if you like, and the way that they share jobs, I'm very clearly in the aviation security. The passenger checkpoint is a good example. You always need to have a person there. You'll always will, because machines are not perfect. They have false alarm rates, and that means they need to be resolved, and that only really can be done sometimes with an aid of machine, but it must be done with a human interface, because they're the ones who need to talk. In terms of our alarm resolution protocols, it's having a quiet chat to somebody. You've got you're allowed to take your medicines and baby food and things like that on board, but they're normally quite thick substances. The liquid explosion detection systems, the bottle scanners, if you like, are still being developed. Some are quite good, but some have a higher false alarm rate. But so you might say that person travelling out with the baby, we've got some baby food, does that give a good indication? Why should we be doing that? But a human does that. It's not a machine that does that. You might say it's a medicine. Well, why do you need that medicine? If I've got an alarm, it says it's a liquid bomb. Well, you need to have a person to talk and describe that, and then obviously, vast majority of people are law-abiding citizens, and they can take their medicine with them, because machines are not the be-all and end-all. You look at the EU regulation, aviation security. The public document is 150 pages long. Security agents need to know that, and the 60 or 70 pages of the classified bits that tells them what percentages and various other elements they need to deal with. You need someone to interpret that, but you very much have machines as aids to get to the end result, to hopefully passengers can go on their law-abiding passage and catch their flight.
One last question I will take at this point, in case there is any. Yep.
Hello, my name is Ignacio Zahé from Frontex, Research and Development Unit. I would like to reflect on the original topic for this session, dealing with the increasing challenges in moving passengers from one point to another. This discussion has been very interesting. I really want to thank you, the speakers, for this. But in your opinion, at least in my opinion, I don't see a solution. I have not heard something that we can say this is going to help us to deal effectively and efficiently with the problem. So I would like to ask each one of you today, what is the one thing that you will change, that you will really change in order to cope with the increasing challenges that we have in passenger flows. Thank you.
Well, Ignacio, thank you for that, because it was my final question for the panelists, actually. But okay, starting with David and then Charlotte and Huub, we use this as the concluding remarks of this panel.
An easy one, really, in respect. And it's certainly for, as I said, that aviation security is very much 100% screening of everybody. We need to move to a risk-based security, a risk-based focused on detecting bad people and not bad objects. That means you'll be able to get more people through your airports more securely.
Charlotte?
I think linked to that, I would say a more solid use of intelligence and means of sharing intelligence across relevant agencies and ploughing intelligence back into the system so that we can use it to look out for people and spot people and deploy better as a result.
Huub?
Focus more on the human-non-human interaction. Acknowledge that technology is not finished once it's used in practice, and acknowledge that training is always necessary. But you, if I might add one thing, you're working for Frontex. My suggestion would be choose another name. Change the name of Frontex. I think expectations are too high now. I think to the public at large, Frontex is seen as the central headquarters of border control in Europe, whilst your task is mainly oriented at collaborating, coordinating, training programs, financing, supporting. Either you change that image or you change the name, otherwise expectations will be too high and you can't do it right in the eyes of the public if the expectations do not level with reality.
Thank you, Huub, for this final remark. We will propose this to our executive director, but I cannot promise that it will, change. In any case, I would like to thank the panelists for their participation. Huub, Charlotte, and David, thank you very much for coming here and for participating in this panel. And I also would like to thank all you in the audience for staying here till the end, and also for raising your questions. And I wish you a good lunch. Thank you very much.